This main point activity, called What Are God's Rules, will help the children learn that they should obey God's rules. The children will listen to some stories. They will decide if the person is obeying God's rules or not obeying God's rules. Lead the activity something like this. All right, so who remembers our main point from today?
I will obey God's rules.
That is right, so let's say that together on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I will obey God's rules. Great job. Now earlier we learned that God has rules for us, and now we're going to learn about what some of those rules are. Okay? And I have some stories here, and in these stories there's an example of either a child who is obeying God's rules and a child who is not obeying God's rules. Now if you think the child in the story is obeying God's rules, I want you to give me a thumbs up. But if you think they're not obeying God's rules, give me a thumbs down, okay? All right, here's the first story. Bailey pushed her friend down on her way to get the last swing. Was Bailey obeying God's rules? No, she wasn't obeying God's rules. God wants us to be kind to others, and Bailey wasn't very kind. How about this one? Paige was on the swing at the park. Another little girl walked over and asked if she could swing next. Paige said yes and let the little girl swing. Was that following one of God's rules? Yes, that was. That is awesome. God wants us to share, and Paige did just that. How about this one? Aiden enjoys going to church each week where he can learn more about God and his rules. Is Aiden following one of God's rules? Yes, Aiden was following one of God's rules, and he knew that God wanted us to go to church and follow his rules. Now you'll continue to read through all of the stories until you have finished, and then close the activity something like this. So in these stories, we learned how to follow some of the rules that God has for us. So let's say our main point again together, all right? 1, 2, 3. I will obey God's rules. Great job. Now let's remember to obey God's rules this week.